Mary's mind raced as the men drew closer, their faces emotionless but their guns pointed directly at her. Her body trembled, her knees weak. She thought of running, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped. Just as she prepared for the worst, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The men hesitated, exchanging glances. In the distance, flashing blue and red lights appeared. Police. The men turned and bolted towards their SUV, jumping inside before speeding off into the night. Mary collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the police cars surrounded the wreckage. She felt like she had been spared by a miracle, but the terror still clung to her like a shadow. 2 officers rushed over, helping her to her feet. "Are you okay, ma'am?" one of them asked, his eyes full of concern. I don't know," Mary whispered, her body shaking uncontrollably. She pointed to Paul, who was still lying unconscious in the car. "Help him, please." The officers pulled Paul out of the wreck, laying him on the ground while they called for an ambulance. Mary stood frozen, watching everything unfold in a blur. Her world, once filled with glittering lights and luxury, now felt cold and empty. As the ambulance arrived and medics worked on Paul, Mary felt a gnawing fear settle in her stomach. She had nearly lost her life, but for what? Wealth. Comfort. The man who had promised her the world now lay on the ground, bloodied and broken. She stared down at him, her heart heavy with the realization that she had made a deal with the devil. And now, she was paying the price. A few days later, Paul was in the hospital, hooked up to machines, recovering from his injuries. Mary stayed by his side, but the once glamorous life she had embraced was starting to crumble. The police had begun asking questions about the crash, about the men who had chased them. She could see it in their eyes. They suspected Paul was involved in something dangerous, something illegal. Mary tried to block out the guilt and fear gnawing at her soul, but it was too late. The more the police probed, the more she realized that Paul had been hiding something dark from her. And soon, she wouldn't be able to escape it. One evening, as Paul drifted in and out of consciousness, Mary sat in the hospital chair, her mind wandering. The babies she had left behind, they haunted her now more than ever. She thought about their tiny faces, the sound of their cries echoing in her mind. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Paul's business is not what you think it is. You're next. Run before it's too late." Her heart stopped. Who had sent this? How did they know about Paul? Mary's hands shook as she reread the message, her mind spiraling. Could it be true? Was she in danger? The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded. She looked over at Paul, unconscious and unaware of the storm brewing around them. Could she really trust him anymore? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. A man in a crisp suit entered, his face cold and unfeeling. "Miss Mary?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Detective Frank." "I'm afraid I have some news," the man said, his tone serious. "We've uncovered some disturbing information about Mr. Paul's business dealings. He's been involved in money laundering and human trafficking operations." Mary's world shattered. Her stomach churned as the detective's words sunk in. Money laundering. Human trafficking. Paul, the man she had abandoned everything for, was a criminal, a dangerous one. "But I didn't know," Mary stammered, her voice trembling. "I had no idea." Detective Frank gave her a hard look. "You're not under arrest, Miss Mary, but we need your cooperation. You've been living with him. You must know something." Mary felt sick. The room spun around her as the weight of her choices came crashing down. She had walked blindly into a life of luxury, never asking questions, never doubting the man who had promised her everything. And now, She was caught in the middle of a nightmare. That night, after the detective left, Mary couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her mind racing. Everything she thought she knew about Paul was a lie. He had lured her in with promises of a lavish life, but behind the riches was a darkness she couldn't have imagined. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, Paul finally woke up the next morning. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but he reached for her hand as if nothing had changed. "We need to leave, Mary," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They are coming for me. We can still escape." Mary pulled her hand away, stepping back from the bed. "Paul, I know what you've been doing. The police, they told me everything." Paul's eyes darkened. "They are lying. Don't listen to them. You know I did this all for us, right? To give you a life you deserve." Her chest tightened. "A life I deserve? You lied to me. You've put me in danger, you've made me a part of this without telling me the truth." Paul struggled to sit up, wincing in pain. "Mary, we don't have time. They'll come after you too. You're in this now whether you like it or not." Mary's blood ran cold. She realized the truth, there was no way out. Paul wasn't just in trouble, he had dragged her into his dangerous world, and now she was a target too. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. She had been running from her responsibilities, from her children, from the life she had been too afraid to face. But now, she knew she couldn't run anymore. "I'm not going with you, Paul," she said, her voice firm. "I'm going to the police. I'll tell them everything." Paul's face twisted with anger. "You think you can just walk away? You think they'll let you off the hook? You're just as guilty as I am." Mary's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "I don't care what happens to me. I won't be a part of this anymore." Paul glared at her, his fist clenched. "You're making a mistake, Mary. They won't protect you. You'll lose everything." But Mary knew she had already lost everything that truly mattered. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. The next morning, Mary walked into the police station, her heart heavy but her step steady. She sat down with Detective Frank, ready to tell him everything she knew. It wasn't easy. The guilt of her choices, the pain of leaving her babies behind, it all came crashing down on her as she recounted her story. But with every word, Mary felt a strange sense of relief. She had been running for so long, but now, she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Paul was arrested a week later, charged with his crimes. The men who had been after him were also caught, and slowly, Mary's life began to unravel in ways she had never imagined. But even as she faced the uncertain road ahead, one thought remained in her mind: the children she had left behind. She had abandoned them once, but she would not abandon them again. Mary knew the road to redemption would be long and painful, but for the first time, she was ready to walk it. Not for the life of glamour she had once dreamed of, but for the chance to be the mother her children deserved. For the next few days, Mary stayed in the house, too afraid to go out. The media began to report on Paul's crimes, calling him a dangerous criminal. People who once admired Mary now turned their backs on her, whispering behind her back. She was trapped, alone, and frightened. Then, one night, as she lay in bed, she heard soft cries. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the cries grew louder, like a baby's cry. She sat up, her heart racing. Could it be her babies? Had they come back to haunt her? She ran to the window and looked outside. There was no one there, but the cries continued, echoing in her mind. Mary fell to the floor, clutching her head. The guilt of leaving her children behind was too much to bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to leave you." The next morning, Mary decided to visit the hospital where she had left her triplets. She needed to know what happened to them. She hoped they were taken by a kind family, but deep down, she feared the worst. When she reached the hospital, the sterile smell and the hustle of nurses and doctors brought her back to that fateful day. Mary hesitated at the entrance, her heart pounding. She could feel the judgment in the eyes of the staff as they passed by, their gazes lingering on her with suspicion and something close to disdain. She pushed down the fear and approached the front desk. "I'm looking for my children, the triplets," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse behind the desk raised an eyebrow, her expression hardening. "Triplets," she repeated. "And what would your name be?" "Mary," she replied, forcing herself to meet the nurse's gaze. "Mary Johnson." The nurse's eyes narrowed, and her expression turned cold. "Oh, I remember you," she said with a tone laced with disdain. "You're the mother who left her newborns without a second thought, aren't you?" Mary felt the shame burn her cheeks. She wanted to explain, to justify her actions, but she knew that there was nothing she could say to erase the hurt she had caused. All she could do was nod, her head hanging low. "Yes," she whispered. I made a mistake. But I'm here to make it right. I want to see them. Please, just let me see my children." The nurse let out a harsh sigh, folding her arms. "Do you think it's that simple? Do you think you can just waltz back in here and reclaim them after what you did? Those children were abandoned, left to fend for themselves. And now you want to play mother?" Mary's heart twisted. The words were like knives, cutting deep, but she couldn't argue. She had done exactly that, abandoned them, left them to an uncertain future. But she was here now, and she wouldn't leave until she knew they were safe. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm ready to do whatever it takes to be a part of their lives again." The nurse's expression softened, but only slightly. She looked down at her computer, tapping a few keys before looking back up at Mary. "Your children were here for weeks, waiting for you to come back," the nurse said, her tone more subdued. "But no one came. Eventually, they were placed with an orphanage. They are not here anymore." Mary's heart sank. Her babies, her little ones, had been taken to an orphanage. She felt the ground slip away beneath her feet as the weight of her actions settled in. She had been so focused on escaping her past that she hadn't thought about the consequences for them. "Where are they now?" Mary asked, her voice barely a whisper. The nurse sighed again, softer this time. "They were taken to New Hope Orphanage," she said. "But I'll warn you, Miss Johnson, they are not just going to hand those children back to you. They've been hurt enough." Mary nodded, feeling the weight of the nurse's words. She knew it wouldn't be easy, nothing about this journey was. But she would find her children, no matter what it took. "Thank you," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll go to the orphanage." The nurse gave her one last look, her eyes a mixture of pity and judgment. "Good luck," she said, before turning back to her walk. A few days later, Mary made her way to the orphanage. The road to New Hope Orphanage was long and winding, but Mary walked every step with a determination that refused to waver. When she finally arrived, the orphanage was nothing like she had imagined. It was a humble building with faded paint and a worn-out sign, but she could hear the laughter of children playing inside, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine her babies among them. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The receptionist looked up, giving her a polite smile. "Hello, how may I help you?" Mary cleared her throat, her voice trembling. I'm here to see the triplets who were brought here a few months ago. I'm their mother." The receptionist's smile faded, her eyes assessing Mary with a look of guarded skepticism. "One moment, please," she said, disappearing into the back room. After a few minutes, a woman with a gentle yet stern expression appeared. She introduced herself as Mrs. Lawson, the orphanage's director. "You're here for the triplets?" Mrs. Lawson asked, her voice calm but cautious. "Yes," Mary replied, her hands trembling. I made mistakes, but I want to see my children. Please, just let me see them." Mrs. Lawson looked at Mary with a mixture of hesitation and sympathy as she listened to Mary's plea to see her children. Finally, she let out a soft sigh and nodded. She cleared her throat gently, her expression turning somber. "Mary," she began, hesitating as if deciding how much to say. "There's something you need to know." Mary's gaze snapped to Mrs. Lawson, fear tightening her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Mrs. Lawson's eyes softened, but her words hit like a blow to the chest. "When your children were brought here, they had been without proper care for days, and they were fragile, especially the youngest." She paused, glancing away as if the memory pained her. "One of the babies, your son, he cried for days, hungry, missing his mother's touch. But he didn't make it. He passed away shortly after arriving." Mary's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, a guttural sob escaping her. "No, no, no, please, no," she clutched at her chest, her heart breaking in ways she never thought possible. Her son, the baby she never got a chance to know, was gone. She had abandoned him to a cruel fate, all because she wanted a life of luxury. As she knelt there, shuddering with sobs, Mrs. Lawson placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mary, there's something else," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Mary looked up, her tear-streaked face full of despair. "The other two, they were adopted," Mrs. Lawson continued softly. "A wealthy couple who had been struggling to have children of their own came in a month after they arrived here. They fell in love with your twins. They gave them a home, a stable life filled with love. It was the best thing for them." The words hit Mary like a second blow. Her remaining children were gone, now part of another family, a family that had been desperate for children, a family that would give them the love she hadn't. Her entire world crumbled around her. Mary wanted to scream, to tear at the walls, to turn back time and change everything. But it was too late. She had chased wealth, glamour, and all the false promises Paul had whispered into her ears, only to end up here, empty, broken, and alone. Weeks passed, and Mary wandered the streets in a daze, haunted by memories she could never change. She found herself staring into shop windows, seeing her own hollow eyes reflected back, wishing with everything in her that she could go back. She tried to forget, to escape the reality she had created, but the faces of her children haunted her dreams, their voices echoing in her mind. In the quiet moments, she could almost hear her son's cries, the baby boy she had lost. She would imagine holding him, comforting him, and it shattered her every time, knowing she would never get that chance. Her life spiraled. She lost the home she once shared with Paul, the mansion filled with luxuries that no longer meant anything to her. She drifted through the days, hollow and filled with regret, clinging to memories that now felt like chains around her heart. In the end, Mary was left with nothing but the weight of her choices. She had abandoned everything real for an illusion, and now she would spend her life haunted by the family she had lost forever. The regrets were endless, circling around her like ghosts, a reminder of what she had thrown away in pursuit of a life that had crumbled before her very eyes. Mary lived the rest of her life in sorrow, wishing she could turn back the hands of time, but knowing deep down that some mistakes could never be undone.